Yeah, I wanted to start recording.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, whenever you like, we
I
can.
I think
Do do you want us to stop the video or do you want to see us?
Oh, I like
oh
to see people.
Okay.
Enough of the two-dimensional screen. I'd much rather see faces. So I'm welcome. Good to see you.
great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And I had thought maybe we would ask questions in the chat box, but I think that we'll probably just be able to ask questions in person. Before we start, I did want to thank Next 50 Initiative for making this possible. Any donation would be greatly appreciated if you wanted to go to bluesage.org at the top of the website. And Dr. Stephen Porges is author of the Polyvagal Theory, distinguished university scientist at Kinsey Institute at Indiana University, professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina. He's author of several books, and if I was going to start in on his bio, that would take up all of our time. When I first started researching Dr. Porges, there are pages on a Google search. So please Google and you're going to find a lot of information. But so Dr. Porges, I guess I would want to start off because the reason I was inviting you with us here tonight was to find out about stress, particularly because of COVID, and I've noticed that in so many of our patrons here in Paonia, and how it affects our bodies and how we can alleviate those stress symptoms.
Yeah, I think, first of all, please call me Steve because if you don't, we'll violate part of the rules of polyvagal theory, which is accessibility and not evaluation. We want to be, in a sense, co-regulating or interacting together. So let's talk about what it is to be a human being, what our needs are. Our needs are really, we're a social species, but we have tended to believe that social behavior is independent of our biology. We play, we interact, but then we work. And if you start getting biological symptoms, or physical symptoms, you go to a physician and they look at how your organs are functioning. If they can't find something wrong, you might be blamed by saying it's something in your head, you're making it up or it's all in your mind. We have to rechange our view of what it is to be a human organism. And that is, our social behavior is part of our biological system. We need to interact to regulate our physiology. So we could toss the word stress out because it really doesn't convey enough information. We start to operationalize stress as if there's a chemical like cortisol or something in our body that is defining stress, when in reality, stress is when the neural regulation and neurochemical regulation of our body is no longer supporting health, growth, and restoration, but now has been diverted to support reactions to threat. So think of this continuum. We're vulnerable and reactive to threat on one side, and the other side, we're accessible, co-regulatory, and interactive. Where do you want to be? I mean, there's actually, it's a question that it has a lot more to do with where does our society want to be. So if we think of our society, if kids are in school, they're evaluated all the time, and that puts their bodies into states of threat. And if you're parents or were parents and had kids at one time, they're very sensitive to what's going on in school. Someone will get gut problems. Their bodies are going to react to cues of threat. Now, when people are older and they are in work environments and they get a bad review or they get into a fight with a supervisor and they feel it in their body, they said that was toxic stress. But when the child doesn't want to go to the school and says, I feel bad, you tell the child, well, you should go get over that. But the body is telling the child, just like your body is telling you, when you're challenged in a work environment, that this isn't good for you. And we have a habit within our culture. It's more than a habit, and that is not to listen to our bodies. And we need to understand that our bodies are trying to do good things for us and not necessarily get us out of work, because if we feel bad, we won't work. Most people want to do their jobs. Most kids want to be good kids. It's part of human nature to be interactive. So the first point is that what we learn from our own neurobiology and from research and even from our own intuitions is that our social behavior is an important tool in regulating our stress reactions, or we could say our reactions to threat, or our reactions to being evaluated, or our reactions to fear. Social relationships are important, and we can think back in terms of looking at the archetypical ones. Think of a mother with a crying baby. What is she doing? Is she yelling at the baby not to cry? Or is she smiling at the baby and using a voice that has lots of melodic intonation and facial and hand gestures that are signaling the child that the child is safe in the presence of the mother? And these are very important cues to children, and actually they're important cues to mammals, because if you have a dog, you'll realize that your dog will respond in the same way. You'll talk to the dog with a melodic voice, the dog will calm down. You talk to the dog with a low, monotone, booming voice, the dog will get into a state of fear and may even urinate right on the floor. So you can see the body reacting. And the important point here is that we, as social mammals, have a nervous system that detects cues of safety. And when we detect cues of safety, we downregulate our reactions to threat, meaning we have our own built-in anti-stress system. But we, like all other vertebrates, react to threat. And that gets us into this state of fight, flight, or mobilization. And in some cases, with overwhelming threat, people will basically pass out or shut down.
Well, I would like to ask another question. I had noticed there was a body perception questionnaire.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it had 46 questions about how stress can affect your body. And it's like, do you feel this? Do you feel that? Well, I said yes to one. But does stress actually affect all of us in all those ways, and we just are not aware of it?
Well,
and how do we become aware of it?
Well, there are two things. The magic word there is aware. So that questionnaire that's on my webpage, and anyone is welcome to use it, and there's a scoring manual for it as well. It really is a surrogate for measuring the physiology of the individual. Because if you want to measure physiology, you have to put electrodes on and equipment. These are really asking the person about the symptoms of their own bodily reactions. And what is really interesting is, now we'll talk about a COVID study that we did. So we did a study, a survey of almost 2,000 people, an internet study, asking questions about the reactions during the pandemic, psychological ones, including PTSD symptomatology, anxiety, and worry. And worry symptoms were very varied, financial, health, a whole variety. But we also asked them about early childhood, or no, we asked them about adverse experiences, meaning did they have childhood trauma, did they have, did they witness let's say a rape or a murder in their family, a variety of adverse ones. And you might know of these types of scales as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. They're very common now. They, when you look at these childhood experiences, they tend to be related to a variety of mental and physical health issues. But we actually created our own. And what we found was the accumulated adverse experiences affected their body reactions, or their body perception of their own system. The more adversity, the more physiologically or autonomically reactive they came out on the scale. Now, the important part around COVID was the early childhood, the adverse experiences led to more adverse reactions to COVID. We're not talking about infections, we're talking about mental health issues. More adversity in their life, greater psychological reactions to the pandemic. However, virtually all of that effect was accounted for if we looked at their basically subjective measurement of their autonomic nervous system, their physiology, or what you were calling their stress responses. So the pathway was adversity retunes one's nervous system to be more autonomically, more physiologically reactive to threat, and that leads to poor mental health outcomes during pandemic. Now, there's some things that are kind of like embedded in our culture already from the news. We've learned, at least people talk about pre-existing conditions. We've all heard that in terms of the pandemic. It's pre-existing conditions will create a higher risk for getting the disease or poor outcome. But what is a pre-existing condition? And what our work is showing is that living a life in which you've experienced adversity, adverse experiences, traumatic experiences, retunes your nervous system so that you've had, in a sense, pre-existing conditions to have adverse reactions, at least on the mental health side, and I'm sure it would lead to the physical health as well.
So can I become aware? I mean,
okay, let's
yeah.
go. Okay, let's talk about awareness. You have to think. I really want. So the second part of your question really was the reason I was trying to give the background was that there's an ambivalence here. One has to be a little bit careful because becoming too aware of one bodily state is not a positive one, but being numb to one's body is not a positive one either. So adverse experiences often result in people being more numb to their body, and they will do things like addictive behaviors, exercise or drugs, and will not have the capacity to use social interactions as their primary mode to regulate their state. But let me I have a term that's part of the polyvagal theory model, and the term is neuroception. And that's the nervous system's evaluation of risk in the environment without awareness. That means we react to threat without knowing what the threat is. So you hear a horn beeping, your body goes in and you step back for the curb. You don't know what it is. Your body reacts long before you could make any interpretation of what the signal is. And that's what neuroception does. And when I described the baby who was crying, relaxing when the mother was singing, that's a neuroception of safety. And that's cues of safety. So we as mammals can be cued for safety or threat. And when we get cued for safety, we downregulate those threat responses. Now, here's the point relevant to what you're saying. Whenever we experience this process of neuroception, we are usually aware of our bodily state changes. So if someone yells at you, you will feel it in your body. Let's say that you feel something in your body and you don't know what the trigger was, but your mind is really creative, and you say it's because your husband said something. Or you had a bad day, you come in and your face is no longer radiant and interactive and inviting and accessible, and your husband sees you that way, and his face drops, and you look at him, you get a physiological response and say, "Why are you angry at me?" And this is the way that people react, because they don't know what the cues are that trigger their body. So the rule is you tend to be aware of your bodily reaction, but since the reaction occurs long before you can actually identify what triggered it, you make it up. You make up a narrative of what triggers it. And that's how you get into these amazing arguments, and I've been there, where the argument has nothing to do with what's going on, But the feelings that were triggered now have to have an outlet, and we're almost kind of creating a justification, a self-justice that we are entitled because the person, in a sense, violated some moral thing or ethical thing in our mind. It's really quite amazing how people react and then get into arguments. And I often say, you can't win an argument. Arguments are not to be won. Arguments are when you have both sides having those visceral responses, and in reacting, the people are losing their ability to witness each other. So the issue is thinking about yourself. If you went through the scales and you were not really aware of these things, that's not necessarily bad. On our reactivity scales, if you're not aware of those, then you're buffered. If you are reactive a lot on those subscales of what were called stress reactivity scales, then you're going to be very sensitive to the world you're in. It doesn't make you good or bad. It's an understanding of your body. And if you're hypersensitive, if you're on that high sensitivity level, then there are things that you need to start thinking about of how you can shift your own bodily state so that you're less reactive. Now, it's not saying don't be reactive. You don't yell at yourself. You say, I'm in that physiological state, and we've all been there. And where you're irritable, you know when you're irritable, and other people, if you don't, other people will tell you. And you say, well, if I can shift my physiological state, I might be a more accessible human being. I might get along better. So how do we shift our physiological state? As a species, or I said, we evolve with certain portals to regulate this relatively efficiency. Something as simple as exhaling slowly will calm our body down, shift our physiological state, and make us more accessible. However, if we reverse that and inhale slowly and exhale rapidly, we are working ourselves up. And that's because during our exhalation, we are changing the neural regulation of a pathway in our autonomic nervous system called the vagus. It's actually increasing the vagal influence on our heart's pacemaker. It's functionally calming our heart down and inhibiting our fight-flight reactions, our sympathetic nervous system. So people often, as I say, take a deep breath. But what we really want to say is take a breath and exhale slowly. And I'll give you a real life example. Actually, I'll give you two examples. One was I was giving a talk at UCLA, and it was a conference, and there was 1,000 people at the meeting, and the person who was going to introduce me the night before comes up to me and she says, Steve, I am really scared about introducing you tomorrow. I said, what's the problem? She said, I really get scared in front of people. And when you're at a party, you act I would say I acted in I don't know why I said this, but I said, don't worry about it. I'll fix it. So the next morning at 10 minutes to 9, she comes up to me and she says, okay, now fix it. And I was watching how she was speaking, and she was basically taking a breath on each word. She was gasping. She was like kids when they get upset. They're breathing in those ways, upper chest and very short exhalations. And you probably have seen this in relationships with other people. So I said, extend the durations of your phrases. Add words before you take a breath. And it was very hard in the beginning. And then she started to add words after words. Her face changed expression, her breathing changed. She calmed down, and she went up and did a great introduction. And now she uses that method in part of her clinical practice for dealing with people who have social anxiety. But the point was that we have this tool with us. And when I do workshops, I used to do a couple experientials, and one was taking slow exhalations, and the other one was taking slow inhalations and rapid exhalations. And I'd have people paired off, and they would kind of evaluate each other and see what was going on. The interesting part was that for many people, when they did the slow inhalation and rapid exhalation, which mobilizes the body, places it in a greater state of threat, they said to me, it's really interesting. When I did it that way, the person who I was standing across from watching me, I thought I was doing something wrong. I thought that I looked at her face, and her face, it was like I wasn't doing something right. I was, was I breathing wrong? And then when I reversed the breathing, I said, wow, what an interesting person. I'd like to get to know that person better. So it was really this simple realization that slight shifts in our physiological state change how we interact with each other from, oh, I'm accessible, I'd like to get to know you, versus I didn't do anything wrong, did I? So we're really moving back and forth between those two different states, and the way we breathe can help us. It's a toolkit that we have on board, and we can think about it that people hum or sing to relax themselves, whistle. I used to think about my younger days when I was, let's say, an adolescent and a young adult. I was a clarinetist. I played the clarinet, and slow exhalation is part of playing a wind instrument. And I was, in a sense, deconstructing that from the science that I was really now doing. I realized that I was really having the capacity during those stressing years of adolescence, calming down, because I was playing the clarinet. I would do long, holding the tones, chromatics and exhalations. And it was, I later learned that if you were a yoga person, you'd be calling that pranayama yoga. So it was that the yoga of breath, the mechanisms of calming through breathing were well known. So we can do different things. Now, I will also say that when I would talk about playing the clarinet in my talks, the string instrument players and the keyboard players and the percussionists would basically get all upset. They said, because I used to say wind instruments, this is the real thing. They said, no, you got it all wrong. We all breathe that way because we're breathing with the phrasing of the music. But I wouldn't let them go with that. I said, with the clarinet and with wind instruments, you have no choice. And so for me, it was, you have no choice. For them, they were in the mood of the music. And it's really interesting to get into the dialogue, again, within the arts about how people regulate. And in the arts, when there are group activities, there are also forms of co-regulating with each other.
I'd like to ask a question along those lines about the vagus nerve and asthma. Would that breathing technique help, or?
You want to know whether it's, well, if we go back to the, let's say, the old days of sending people with asthma to the hills and to the mountains, and some of the breathing exercises they had the people do who had asthma, it was slow exhalations. It was like ping pong balls, kind of keep them up on blowing them to keep the airwaves moving. The interesting thing with asthma, and asthma is or I should say the bronchi, the interesting part about the bronchi is that they are regulated by the vagus as well. But the constriction that is the asthma attack may also be vagal. There are two different branches of the vagus, and they may be, both of them, affecting the bronchi. And the older branch, which is primarily subdiaphragmatic, going below your diaphragm, is an ancient one, and it was the primary defense for reptiles and older more primitive vertebrae. And what did they do under threat? They stopped breathing. So the system basically shut itself down. And if you think about preterm babies, when they're under challenge, what happens? Their heart rates go very slow and they become apneic. They stop breathing. So they have what's called Bradycardian Apnea. And that's this older vagal system coming in to shut them down. Because what they're having is a primitive reaction of conservation of resources, which could be lethal for mammals, but keeps reptiles alive who are under threat, because reptiles have small brains. They don't need much oxygen. So the answer will always be, there's always going to be a similarity. If we think of your question in terms of how is the more positive vagal influence affect asthma, we'll come to the point that if our bodies move out of states of threat, our bodies become more neurally homeostatic, meaning that they become less defensive and reactive. And that is then seeing asthma as a defensive reaction of the system. And we know enough from many disorders that the symptomatology gets exacerbated when people feel stressed out. And we know that, so if we translate that into polyvagal terminology, being stressed out is removing the newer mammalian ventral vagal circuit that supports homeostatic function. We disrupt that and we now become vulnerable to the threat reaction. And if we translated asthmatic attacks as part of a neural circuit of a threat reaction that was very adaptive for vertebrates that were not mammals, then stuff starts making it makes a little sense. So the simplicity of my answer is, if you're relaxed, if you're safe, if you're accessible, if you're calm, everything's better in life.
Thank you.
Well, how about the chronic stress that everyone seems to be living in right now with COVID?
Well, I think what's happened. Okay, so I wrote a paper for, and I sent it to Deborah, and you can share it with anyone you like.
I did share that with everyone through the chat.
It's an open access journal, so it's fine. I was the editor of this journal is outside of Rome, and he contacted me and he said, "I'd like you to write an editorial about the pandemic. We're doing a special issue." And I said, "I'm on board. I want to do this." And the title had something to do with, my title was Our Paradoxical Reactions to the Pandemic. And let's go through this. And this is really why the pandemic is so devastating to who we are as social beings. The first thing is we're under threat. Our body reacts to being under threat. Now, like all forms of threat, we're often not aware of our actual reactions because we get used to it. So when we're under threat, our bodies get retuned to be more reactive. Now, what does that mean in your home environment? More irritable, more fighting, less tolerant, less resilient. So we don't have that same type of resilience or resource. But let's think about what has been the evolutionary history of humanity in terms of when people have been under forms of threat. How do they mitigate threat? How does a child mitigate threat? Goes to the mother or the parent. How does an adult mitigate threat? Talks to someone, negotiates with another person. We've used our social interaction as the primary mechanism to mitigate our threat reactions. And most of us have used this therapeutic co-regulatory strategy, not just with one person, not just with our spouse, but with a variety of people who serve to be our social environment. But what's happened with the pandemic? At best, we're with our spouse. And there are people who aren't with anyone, and there are other people who are contained with people that they don't feel safe with, and there are children who are placed in those settings as well. So the ability to find that safe individual who is skilled in listening and witnessing and supporting is rare because, again, this is a cultural thing. Our culture sees vulnerability as something that needs to be fixed, but the vulnerable person doesn't want anything really fixed. They want someone to support them. They want someone to listen to them without evaluating them. And so we want to be witnessed, and unfortunately, few of us have been trained to be good witnesses, in a sense, to be supportive and to listen without evaluation. So in the world that I stepped into about 20 years ago and haven't left, is the world of trauma. And the world of trauma is really a remarkable world to be involved in because it teaches you about what it is to be a human. And you learn that by listening and witnessing survivors of trauma as they tell you what is lost in their life. What's lost is their ability to feel safe enough with another person, to be in their arms and to trust them. Now, what's interesting is their bodies don't allow another person to come close to them because they've been deeply injured. But their minds have this wonderful quest. It's really a beautiful desire to be able to find someone to be loved and to love another, although their bodies are not often, at least initially, a good, their bodies do not comply with what their minds want. So we realize that our bodies kind of learn things that don't always fit with our mental image of who we think we are. And so with trauma-informed therapists, people start to realize, or therapists realize, that you don't say you should be social, you should go out, you should interact with people. What the client wants to hear is an understanding of where they are, a respect for their journey, and not an evaluation that they aren't out there regulating well. So I guess another model is a model of grieving, because I think that has touched many of our lives, where someone has died, and after a few months or maybe a year, you say to the person, hey, you have lots of things to live for, go out, have a good time. And that's not being a good witness, because the person is still uncomfortable in their own body, experiencing the loss of a loved one. And we, as a society, do a very poor job in, let's say, teaching this. We need to have this great respect for the journeys that other people have been on.
So what you were just talking about, is that what biological imperative is? That basically what you're talking about?
It's a beautiful word. I think our biological imperative is to connect with others.
Yeah.
And once we respect the fact that we need to socially, emotionally connect with others, remember, so much of our schooling and our life and the mandates that are really directed at our children are: take care of yourself, don't trust other people. Our bodies want to co-regulate. Our bodies want to trust others. It's not that we want to be dependent on, we want to be co-regulatory with. And there's a difference to that. It's not like I want to depend, but I want to feel that there's someone there for me that trusts me and I trust them. So our biological imperative is to be safe. I would use the metaphor, safe in the arms of another human or appropriate mammal. So some people, since they may have some adverse history with other people, they may elect as their co-regulatory mammal to have a dog or a horse. I mean, there are people that I know who do that, and it helps them regulate. They feel the support, they feel the love, and they really feel that emotional support. We evolved really to interact with humans, but we have substitutions. If we study the evolution of mammals, when they first evolved, were very small, and they were functionally food in the world of reptiles. But they survived, and they survived because they cooperated with each other, and they communicated with each other, and they signaled each other that they were safe enough to come close to. And that signaling often occurred through their voice. Now, what's interesting on the neurophysiology is that our vocalizations, the intonation, the tone of our voice, is regulated by the vagus. So in a sense, we're broadcasting our physiological state in our voice. We are conveying to another that we are safe enough for you to come close. And we're in a society that has, and I'm going to say, disrespectful to the intonation of voice, but very respectful to words. Words are important. I'm not going to say words are not important, but the intonation of the voice is what triggers our physiological state. That's the portal that will calm us down. So if we're a good witness, if we're a good friend, our intonation of voice is critical. It's not what we're going to say. It's when we say it, are we sending cues that, in a sense, disarm and allow the other person to give up their defenses. So yeah, our biological mandate is to connect. That's who we are. And survival of the fittest is not the strongest, not the wealthiest, not the most physically powerful or politically powerful. Our mandate is to feel safe in the presence of others. And I think we've not done a very good job in teaching that mandate to our children, our colleagues, and our friends. Well, our friends obviously get it, because otherwise they wouldn't be our friends.
Well, does anybody else have any questions?
Well, I've heard
A lot of research, so.
what he said, Steve, what you said. I've also heard the phrase survival of the nurtured.
Yeah, we're really getting into this dialogue of co-regulation versus self-regulation. We're dealing with the issues of attachment or nurturance. My model is that those who are nurtured, those who are co-regulated and develop co-regulation skills, have the capacity to be self-regulated. So what we find out is those who feel, in a sense, the metaphors we use would be that the people who feel secure in their relationships are the people who can become bold and secure in their own decisions and in their own explorations. So it's paradoxical, because also we have been taught, again, a cultural directive has been, don't smother, don't mother too much, because you'll create an individual that will not be bold and self-regulatory. And I think it misunderstands the developmental trajectory of what it is to be a social mammal, a human. I think those who are co-regulated well, when I say co-regulated, it means that a parent regulates you, but you as a child are also regulating the parent. All you need to do is look at a mother with a baby. If the baby conforms to the mother's chest, the mother's in heaven. If the baby's a fussy, irritable baby, the mother doesn't feel that good. So the baby is sending cues back to the mother at a rapid rate, and the mother's ability to calm a fussy baby reflects back on how the mother may feel about herself. So she needs also to be educated to understand that it's not intentional. So our first son was very colicky. And the issue on that is, if the child's in pain, they're not going to be very conforming. And so we have to have a better understanding that the child's intention is to be a child, but when a child is in pain, they're going to express that as part of a defensive mode.
So then is a loner, a person that they call a loner, are they on that fight?
So you're going to, once you start, okay, so we're going into these issues of because there are a vast range of individual differences. And the question of a loner, a person who is either does things on their own, you have to ask the question, does the person do things on their own and doesn't create relationships, or has relationships and likes to work on their own? Or if the person can't form relationships, are they on the spectrum of autistic disorders? Or I shouldn't use the term autistic disorders, but autistic symptoms. From my theoretical perspective, many people who may find themselves on the spectrum are there because their physiological state is in a state of threat. And that it can be retuned. And that's actually part of the intervention that I developed, which was called the Safe and Sound Protocol, which basically uses acoustic cues of safety to calm the body, functionally like an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator. So many individuals who have autistic symptoms, if their bodies calm down, they may start expressing some spontaneous social behavior. The idea is not that this cures autism, but it optimizes that nervous system's capacity to co-regulate and socially interact. So I don't, we get stuck in some other concepts. We think of temperament as permanent. So you start saying a loner or a withdrawn person. And when some of it can be merely a shift or a retuning of the state that the child or the adult has come into. So think on a metaphoric level that water has different states. It could be steam, it could be a fluid, it could be gas as steam, or a fluid as normal water, or a solid like ice. Still, it's water. It's the same molecular structure. Our nervous system shifts into accessibility states of safety, and when that gets turned off due to cues of threat, that's gone. We don't have access to that. Our body now has a low threshold to go into fight or flight. And if that system doesn't get us into safety, we have the probability that we'll totally shut down. Same person. If we get the cues of safety into the system, the whole portfolio of behavior starts to become coordinated. So now when we talk to each other, we're socially interactive, but if we're mobilized, we still talk to each other, and we call that play. So play is that we're active, mobilized, but play is different than fight and flight or aggression because we are making facial contact and talking to each other. And you can see this in professional sporting events where people will hit each other and everything's fine if you bend over and help the person up. But if you hit someone in a basketball game and walk away, it's going to provoke a fight because the diffusing of the cues of mobilization, the cues of threat, are diffused through the social interaction. And if you have a dog, you can watch dogs play. Dogs are really, they're wonderful in demonstrating these effects. That dogs actually play catch with each other. They run after each other, and they don't, since they don't tag and say you're it, they bite the rear leg. Now the dog that gets bit turns and looks face to face, eye to eye, the dog doing the biting, and basically the dog wants validation that that bite was not aggressive. Now, how is it determined that it's not aggressive? The bite is released and they roll reverse. The dog that was chasing is now the one being chased. And this is how children play as well. And if they don't make that face-to-face acknowledgement, someone gets hurt. And there are fights on playgrounds. And this is part of the reason that autistic children have difficulty being welcomed into play groups, because they're not attentive. They don't have the resource to provide those cues back to other people. And if you don't get the cues, you get hurt. And children like to play. They don't like to get hurt. They do get hurt, but they like to play.
So I'm just kind of thinking, talking about children, how it is affecting students and even like high school students, where this year seniors lost a whole year of all, you're talking about that social interaction.
Yeah.
So how do we as adults, how can we help with that?
I'm sitting back, and I'll give you some. I just don't. I am relatively. I'm old now, but I still have memories of my adolescence, and I can't imagine being a year isolated from my peer group. I can't imagine a year being in the house with my parents. My parents were lovely people, but they didn't have a clue about who they really had as a son. I just don't understand how people are managing this. I have great respect. My son has a 3-year-old daughter, and he's a faculty member and his wife is getting a PhD, how they are managing this activity level. Oh, they have five, let's see, they have 2 dogs and 3 cats, all this activity in this space, when we really realize that our social life is not focused on one person. Our social life has a variety, diversity, because it enables us to have curiosity and also diffuse tensions. You asked a very important question. And in the world that I'm in, I'm not a clinician, but I do a lot of work with clinical people. So, meaning I do workshops and lectures, and I get a lot of questions regarding things. And these are serious questions. But what I'm learning is that many kids are not doing well during this period of time. But there are some that like it. And this goes back to your comment about being loners. Those that are a little bit more on spectrum, those who have been bullied in classrooms, they're thriving or doing well, let's use that term. But many children are really kind of lost. It's not the world that the way it should be. Being in the classroom, having friends is important, having play dates or sleeping over, the normal things that were there in place. So the clinicians who deal with the kids and the families are telling me lots of problems. And it's really this, I would call it the second pandemic. And that is the scars or the damage of being isolated. And where are the resources to deal with that? And where do you go if you have these problems? So right now, clinical work is primarily this way. And again, that works fine with some people, but not necessarily with others. In the world of trauma, it tends to work well with those who are physiologically reactive to leaving their home and novelty disturbs them. They seem to, in a sense, like the internet therapy because they literally have it in their own home. They're safe in their own environment. But children, here's the problem I see is you brought up the thing about being pulled out of the social development that was normal to them. But there's also, not all families are healthy families, just put it that way. I mean, when you survive, quote, a normal family, you always assume that your family's atypical until you really learn about atypical families. And then you really just have this love for the childhood you had. But the issue is that there are a lot of kids who are going through really rough times because their families are going through rough times. Think of those who are food insecure, financially insecure, home insecure during this period of time. And there are, in this country, millions that are that way. And how do we as a society provide the resources to enable them to live their potential? We have nothing in place for this. So I don't have an answer. The only answer is that be aware that the consequences are not even known. And you do have a sense of it, but you don't know the true consequences. And we don't have the resources in place to blunt this second pandemic either.
I have a question. No one's ever told me this, but I've thought it a lot. I work with a lot of children who are on the autism spectrum or have behavioral challenges. And there's an echo, I'm sorry. Sensory processing problems that begin early in life, including just like colicky kids whose guts are out of whack. Their visual processing never got corrected. Their proprioception is off. I see them as traumatized by their own body, even though they can be a really loving family. Their they're not comfortable because they don't feel hands.
Yeah, I'm going to, I wrote a paper, a short paper for a newsletter called Spectrum. It's, I can't remember, it's a Simon's Foundation. And I really, and I'll send it to Deborah and she can share it with you. But it is the fact that I, I feel that the scientific community has really failed the autism community because when searching for a drug without understanding the real problem in the home was state regulation, was the ability to regulate behavior. The same thing is with children who are not necessarily on spectrum but have behavioral problems in the schools. State regulation is the main issue. However, the problem is that the teachers are not taught anything about state regulation other than behavior mod, which means you basically punish the child and you have to understand the child is a good child. The core is good. The behaviors you're seeing are that of a nervous system under a state of threat. And if you go back to your early part of your question, the sensory problems are in part a product of being in a state of threat. And this is what we're doing with this auditory intervention. The sensory problems disappear in many of the children. So the auditory hypersensitivity and the hyposensitivity to understanding human voice, they disappear. And visual hypersensitivity, because your pupil reflex isn't quite working, and other things like gut problems and selective eating, these things significantly are decreased after this intervention program. And if you're interested in finding out more about it, go to my webpage. It's called Safe and Sound Protocol, and there you click on it, it will send you to the company that's distributing it. And they have a lot, actually it's in Denver, the company. So
actually, I just recently got trained in it and I've been starting to use it with students. Like back in North Carolina, and I come back to Paonia often. But I'm really seeing some good things. It's very subtle.
Yeah, it is. Well, what's interesting is if we can get cues of safety into the nervous system. I mean, if you think about portals of bringing cues of safety, now we all have used terms like love cures all. I mean, but basically, what are we really talking about? We're saying, does the body feel safe enough to trust another? If it doesn't, it's going to be in a state of defense. And of course, you're going to have hypersensitivities if you're in a state of defense. It's really a simple paradigm. You respect what the body's doing, and even though what the body is doing doesn't comply with classroom needs or social needs, you basically have the profile of what the body is doing. Now you have to not blame the child for the behavior, but literally trigger a different physiological state that has different emergent properties. And that's the magic word. Our physiological state is the platform upon which different behaviors naturally occur. So you're using the SSP?
I sure am.
Yeah.
I sure am. I don't like the remote, so I insist that I go to the house first and spend the first session being with the child in the safest place. And then I find out something they really love. For one child, Star Wars thoughts, another was Mango, his hamster. And then when I'm working remotely with them, I fashion out of wool that they love. So they watch me doing it, and then I watch them, and we connect.
Yeah. So you're using it in a form of co-regulation. And as long as you get, I mean, the magic is if we co-regulate. Now, I again, I like I bring metaphors back or experiences back as when we're adolescents. When you meet someone, let's say you met your husband, there was a moment of co-regulation. You only heard his voice or he only heard your voice when you're in a noisy thing. That's the system coming on board. And that's what we really are trying to get, this ability of the nervous system to, on its own, reach out to the other person, social engagement. And this goes back to Deborah's first. It's our biological imperative is to connect and to socially engage. And our bodies, our physiology need that, not just to grow and to be healthy, but also to mitigate stress reactions. And I really see that if we don't have this on board, it is that pre-existing condition that will, in a sense, make us vulnerable to lots of different things. Thank you.
Well, does anyone have any other questions?
Anything really challenging? I mean, you have this moment.
I find that interesting about what you were talking with the children and that it's going to be a second pandemic, because I do feel really bad about that. I just worry about the high school students because they're forgotten about a lot of times.
Well,
and they want to be forgotten about, but in this case, it's not so good.
Well, think about when people don't have other people to help them co-regulate. What is the trajectory? Is to find other mechanisms to regulate one's physiology, and that means substance abuse. And the statements like, this is a traumatic experience for many individuals. They're removed from their social network. They're floating. And suddenly, for many of them, like the high school ones, they are now in a different planet. They're in a planet that's run by their parents, as opposed to their friends. I can't imagine. Fortunately, my kids are adults, and the only window to this is my preschooler granddaughter. And it hasn't been easy for her. That was part of the discussion I had with my son over the weekend. I was trying to say that, she's picking up cues from both of you, the wife and the husband. And children pick up these things. It doesn't mean you're saying anything, but we know that your sensitivity to this, concern about getting ill, uncertainties about things, the children are very sensitive to subtle shifts in their environment. So we're talking about high school kids. What about the preschool kids? What about the young ones who their life is dependent upon this metaphor of a secure, safe parent? And what if the parent is insecure during these difficult times, or feels vulnerable? Let's not use the word insecure, but feels vulnerable, and may even feel vulnerable for really rational reasons. The child will pick that up.
One quick question.
Sure.
What about the child who is very dysregulated and hypervigilant and vulnerable, who gets lost in video game?
Oh.
What's happening?
Well, it's not social interaction, is it? And again, it's another way of numbing, and it's another form of addiction. We actually we just submitted a study, and this is with college students, and this is a former graduate student of mine who's a faculty member, and she looked at maltreatment, childhood maltreatment, and then in college, how much exercise and how much video game playing. And you know the answer. If their childhood maltreatment was negligible, since they were not maltreated, exercise, and we measured physiology, the autonomic regulation was good. But if they had childhood traumas or childhood abuse, then they gravitated to video games and didn't exercise very much. So you start seeing, if you see the video game as this attempt to regulate their physiology, and it's just not, it's not the type of strategy that a polyvagal informed person would do. So a polyvagal informed person would be even to talk like we're talking, to be online at best or at worst. But yeah, I think this is what we need to take home from your question. That is, playing video games is not play. The history of play was social interaction and movement. And that was a very important coordination of our neural systems. It was building our resilience. Play was important to our development. That's been removed by our culture, and the term play has been co-opted. Play meant interacting and moving, and dance is interacting and moving. These are integrative strategies that are important for our nervous system. They are neural exercises, and our environment, our school, our educational model has given up on the appropriate neural exercises by dropping recess or more structured play, dropping the arts out of classroom, dropping music in places. Anything, all these things required cooperation of individuals working together, and those are neural exercises. And there's big, let's say, payoffs from having neural exercises that require social interaction.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm just trying to think of ways that I can help the students.
Well,
It's like have them all down here outside in on our back patio, so that they're safe.
Or when I was younger, there used to be Halloween during. It's not Halloween, it's a different season, but they used to paint the store windows with Halloween paintings. Well, it'd be groups or groups of kids doing arts together, a mural or something. So if being an arts center, that you might kind of encourage murals or group paintings or group work like that. And it's social, it's interactive, it's creative, it's team building. That might be something your center could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gonna have to think about it. Well, does anyone have any questions? It's probably past Stephen's dinner time.
Well, yeah, it's actually 8 o'clock here. Well, I will tell you where I am during the pandemic so you can have a good smile. After decades of living in the Midwest, we moved, so in 2012, we moved from Chicago to North Carolina. But then my wife she's an academic also, and she wasn't ready to, in a sense, not have a major lab anymore. So she took a job in Indiana, and I followed her there and created the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium. Then, but the Midwest is the Midwest, and we moved to northern part of Florida. So we're outside of Jacksonville, oceanfront. We have a house on the ocean. In a milder climate where we can sit outside and work and still do our research through collaborations and the internet. I have a research group in Indiana and colleagues still in North Carolina, and I coordinate the work here. And now we're 2 hours from my son who's in Gainesville. So the part is, if you're going to be isolated, you should be isolated in a place that you can see nature. It's living. I didn't realize how important it was, but we sit on the deck and I can hear the ocean. I can see the ocean, and the birds are here, so we have a feeder, they're there. So it's really interesting when there's living activity around you, like a living ocean and trees and squirrels in your backyard. You don't feel alone. So, and Colorado is beautiful. Colder though.
A little bit.
Just a little.
All right. Steve,
Okay.
thank you so much.
Oh, you're
Thank
quite
you.
welcome.
Really appreciate it. I feel honored that you spent some time with us tonight.
Well, listen, I told you I'm flexible and accessible, because if I weren't, I'd be alone, right? So it's very important to me to have interactions, and this is what we do now. So thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed the hour with you and enjoyed your questions, and I hope you have now it's time for your suppers.
Yeah.
Okay. Take good care.
All right. All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.